Marcus Chen had never seen anything like it. Standing beside his Bugatti Chiron at the gas station, watching a 16-year-old boy carefully wrap pieces of cardboard around his baby brother like armor against the bitter February wind. The teenager's fingers were red and cracked from the cold, but his movements were precise, gentle, loving. He didn't know this moment would shatter every assumption he'd ever made about strength. He didn't know this gas station encounter would become the most important business decision of his life. But as the baby's tiny fist grabbed onto the makeshift cardboard coat, one question burned in Marcus's mind. Could a simple act of love teach a billionaire what he'd been searching for his entire life? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button for more real, emotional, life-changing stories like this. And let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The wind cut through downtown Portland like a blade, carrying with it the promise of another sleepless night for 16-year-old David Rodriguez. He shifted his baby brother closer to his chest, feeling the tiny body shiver against him despite the layers of newspaper and plastic bags he'd wrapped around both of them. The gas station's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the cracked pavement, but it was the only shelter they could find that wouldn't get them moved along by security guards. David's stomach cramped with hunger, but the gnawing pain had become so familiar it felt like an old friend. What concerned him more was the way little Miguel's breathing had become shallow and rapid over the past hour. At 14 months old, Miguel didn't understand why they were always cold, always moving, always hiding. All he knew was that his big brother was there, and somehow that made everything bearable. The cardboard David had found behind the grocery store that morning was damp from the previous night's rain, but it was better than nothing. He'd learned to make the best of scraps, to see potential where others saw trash. His fingers worked methodically, tearing strips and folding edges, creating a barrier between his baby brother and the unforgiving world. Each piece he positioned was placed with the careful attention of an architect designing a mansion, because in David's mind, this wasn't just cardboard. This was protection. This was love, made tangible. Marcus Chen pulled his Bugatti into the gas station with the casual indifference of someone who had never questioned where his next meal would come from. At 42, he commanded a technology empire worth $8 billion. But tonight, he felt emptier than he had in years. The board meeting had gone well, the quarterly projections exceeded expectations, and his latest acquisition would likely net him another few $100 million by year's end. Success by every measurable standard, yet something fundamental felt missing from his life. He'd grown up poor in San Francisco's Chinatown, the son of immigrants who'd worked 16-hour days in a laundromat just to keep food on the table. But those days felt like someone else's memories now, dulled by decades of luxury and comfort. Sometimes he wondered if his success had cost him something essential, some connection to the person he used to be. The pump clicked off automatically, but Marcus remained frozen, his hand still gripping the nozzle as he watched the scene unfolding near the station's side wall. The teenage boy couldn't have been more than 16, with dark hair that needed cutting and clothes that had seen better days months ago. But it was the care with which he tended to the baby that made Marcus's chest tighten with unexpected emotion. The boy was singing softly, a Spanish lullaby that Marcus recognized from his own childhood when the neighborhood was more diverse, before gentrification had pushed out the families who couldn't afford rising rents. The melody drifted across the cold air like a prayer, and Marcus found himself holding his breath, afraid to break the spell of tenderness he was witnessing. David felt eyes on him and looked up to see a well-dressed Asian man standing beside an expensive car, staring in their direction. His first instinct was to grab Miguel and run. Well-dressed men usually meant trouble, questions he couldn't answer, systems that would separate him from his brother. But something in the stranger's expression wasn't the usual mixture of disgust and judgment he'd grown accustomed to. Instead, the man looked almost heartbroken. "It's okay, Miguel," David whispered, adjusting the cardboard coat he'd constructed around his brother's small frame. "We're okay. I've got you." Miguel babbled something that might have been an attempt at his brother's name, and David smiled despite everything. That smile, Marcus realized, was what had stopped him in his tracks. It was pure joy in the midst of circumstances that should have crushed anyone's spirit. It was the kind of smile he hadn't seen in his own mirror for years. Marcus approached slowly, the way one might approach a wounded animal, careful not to startle or threaten. "Excuse me," he said gently, his voice carrying none of the authority he wielded in boardrooms. "Are you boys okay?" David's muscles tensed, ready to bolt, but Miguel chose that moment to reach out his tiny hand toward the stranger, making soft cooing sounds. The baby's innocent gesture seemed to bridge the gap between their two worlds, at least momentarily. "We're fine," David said, but his voice cracked slightly on the words. "Just waiting for someone." Marcus had heard that particular lie before, had probably told it himself in various forms throughout his life. It was the lie of someone who had learned that admitting vulnerability was dangerous, that showing need was weakness. He recognized it because he'd spent decades perfecting similar deflections. "Mind if I wait with you?" Marcus asked, settling down on the cold concrete without waiting for permission. The expensive fabric of his tailored suit would probably be ruined, but he found he didn't care. "I'm Marcus, by the way." David studied him warily. "David. This is Miguel." "Miguel," Marcus repeated, and the baby turned toward him with wide, curious eyes. "That's a strong name. My grandfather's name was Miguel." It wasn't true, but it felt like it should be. Marcus had always been good at reading people, understanding what they needed to hear. But sitting here on the cold ground, watching this teenager construct armor out of garbage to protect his baby brother, he found himself wanting to tell the truth instead of just the right thing. "I used to be homeless too," Marcus said quietly, the words leaving his mouth before he consciously decided to speak them. David's head snapped up, searching Marcus's face for signs of deception or mockery. "You? Different circumstances, same fear," Marcus continued. "I was about your age when my parents died in a car accident. Foster care wasn't good to me. I spent a lot of nights on the street, trying to figure out how to survive." The confession hung in the air between them, like a bridge neither had expected to find. Marcus hadn't spoken about those years to anyone, not even his therapist. The memories were locked away in a vault he'd sealed with success and money, and the comfortable fiction that the past was irrelevant to the present. "How did you—" David gestured vaguely at Marcus's expensive clothes, the luxury car gleaming under the station lights. "A lot of luck. Some good people who took chances on me, and more work than anyone should have to do just to survive," Marcus said. "But mostly, I think it was anger. I was so angry at the world for what happened to my parents, at the system that failed me, and every person who looked at me like I was invisible. That anger kept me warm when I had nothing else. David adjusted Miguel's cardboard coat, smoothing down a corner that had started to curl up. "I don't have time to be angry," he said. "Miguel needs me to figure things out, not waste energy being mad about stuff I can't change." The wisdom in those words hit Marcus like a physical blow. Here was a kid who'd been dealt an impossible hand, yet somehow he'd found a way to love instead of hate, to build instead of tear down. When had Marcus last created something purely out of love, without considering the profit margin or competitive advantage? "Where are your parents?" Marcus asked gently. David's jaw tightened. "Mom died when Miguel was born. Dad, he couldn't handle it. Said he had to find work in another state, but that was 8 months ago. Haven't heard from him since." "Other family?" "Mom's sister in Phoenix, but she's got her own kids and barely makes rent. I called her when the money ran out, but—" David shrugged, a gesture that tried to minimize the weight of rejection and abandonment. "She said she couldn't take us both. Said maybe if it was just me, but a baby is too much responsibility." Marcus felt something crack open in his chest, a fissure in the carefully constructed wall he'd built around his emotions. He'd spent years in therapy, learning to process his own abandonment issues, but hearing them, echoed in this teenager's matter-of-fact recounting, brought all of it rushing back. "So you chose him," Marcus said. "It wasn't a question." "He's my brother," David replied, as if that explained everything. And perhaps it did. Miguel had fallen asleep against David's chest, his tiny fist still clutching a corner of the cardboard coat. His breathing had evened out, and some of the tension left David's shoulders as he felt the steady rhythm of his brother's heartbeat against his ribs. "When did you last eat?" Marcus asked. David hesitated. Yesterday. Maybe the day before. Time gets weird when you're trying to stay ahead of social services and find safe places to sleep. Marcus stood abruptly, his sudden movement causing David to tense again. Stay here. I'll be right back. We don't need charity, David called after him. But Marcus was already pushing through the glass doors of the gas station's convenience store. He moved through the aisles like a man possessed, grabbing bottled water, sandwiches, fruit, crackers, anything that looked nutritious and filling. At the baby aisle, he paused, studying the formula and diapers with the intensity he usually reserved for market analysis. When had he last thought about someone else's needs before his own? When had another person's well-being mattered more than his next acquisition or quarterly growth target? The cashier, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, raised an eyebrow at the eclectic collection of items but didn't comment. Marcus paid with his black card, the same way he'd paid for $1,000 dinners and million-dollar art pieces, but somehow this transaction felt more significant than any of those. When he returned, David was still sitting in the same position, but his eyes tracked Marcus's movements with a mixture of hope and suspicion that broke Marcus's heart all over again. I said we don't need charity, David repeated, but his voice lacked conviction. Good thing this isn't charity, Marcus replied, settling back down on the concrete and unpacking the bags. This is one person sharing a meal with another. My grandmother always said food tastes better when you don't eat alone. Another lie that felt more true than most of the truths he told in his daily life. His grandmother had died when he was 5, and most of his meals these days were consumed in solitude, often while reviewing contracts or answering emails. But watching David's facade crumble as he reached for a sandwich with shaking hands, Marcus realized he'd stumbled upon something he'd been searching for without knowing it. They ate in companionable silence, the artificial warmth from the gas station's overhead heater creating a small bubble of comfort in the February night. Miguel woke up halfway through David's sandwich, immediately alert and looking around with the wide-eyed curiosity that seemed to be his default expression. He's always happy, David said, noticing Marcus's amazement at the baby's sunny disposition. Even when we don't have food, even when it's cold, even when I'm scared out of my mind about what we're going to do next, he just finds something to smile about. Marcus watched Miguel grab for his brother's face with chubby fingers, babbling contentedly as David made silly faces in return. The love between them was palpable, unquestionable, and it made Marcus's chest ache with longing for something he'd never had and hadn't realized he was missing. I want to help, Marcus said suddenly. Not charity, not a handout. I want to help you build something better. David's expression closed off again. We've heard that before. Social workers, church people, even some rich lady who said she wanted to make a difference. They all want to help until they realize helping is complicated and messy and doesn't make them feel good about themselves anymore. I'm not going anywhere, Marcus said, meeting David's skeptical gaze. I've got nowhere else to be, and honestly, sitting here with you two is the most real I've felt in years. Real? Marcus leaned back against the gas station wall, feeling the cold seep through his expensive suit jacket. I spend my days making decisions that affect thousands of people, but somehow, I've managed to become completely disconnected from actual human beings. I've got houses I never visit, cars I never drive, more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. But I can't remember the last time I did something that mattered. Really mattered. Money matters, David said quietly. When you don't have it, it matters a lot. You're right, Marcus acknowledged. But watching you with him, seeing how you've taken care of your brother with nothing but cardboard and determination, I think I've been confusing having money with being rich. You're richer than I am in every way that counts. David snorted, a sound caught between amusement and disbelief. You want to trade places? Because I'd be happy to let you figure out where we're sleeping tonight while I drive off in your fancy car. Marcus considered this seriously, which seemed to surprise David. Actually, I was thinking we could figure it out together. What if I told you I've got a guest house that's been sitting empty for 2 years? What if I said you could stay there, no strings attached, while we work out something more permanent? What's the catch? David asked immediately. No catch. Well, maybe one small one. Marcus smiled, and for the first time in months, it felt genuine. I'd like to visit sometimes. Maybe learn how to be human again from you and Miguel. David studied him for a long moment, absently rocking Miguel, who had started to fuss. You're serious? Dead serious. I've got lawyers who can sort out the legal stuff, make sure Miguel's got proper health insurance, get you enrolled in school if you want, but mostly, I'd like to have somewhere to go where people need me for something other than my signature on a check. The offer hung between them like a lifeline neither had expected to find. David had learned to be suspicious of gifts that seemed too good to be true, but there was something in Marcus's eyes that reminded him of his own desperation, a different kind of hunger than the physical emptiness he carried in his brass stomach. Why us? David asked finally. Marcus was quiet for so long that David thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Because watching you wrap your brother in cardboard to keep him warm reminded me of something I'd forgotten. Love isn't about having the resources to solve every problem. It's about using whatever you have, even if it's just cardboard, to protect the people who matter to you. I've got all the resources in the world, but I'd forgotten how to love anyone, including myself. Miguel chose that moment to reach out toward Marcus again, his tiny fingers grasping at the air, as if he could sense the shift in the emotional atmosphere. Without thinking, Marcus extended his hand, and Miguel latched onto his index finger with surprising strength. He likes you, David observed, and something in his posture relaxed slightly. I like him too, Marcus replied, marveling at the warmth of such a small hand, the trust implicit in the gesture. I like you both. They sat like that for several minutes, connected by Miguel's grip on Marcus's finger and the weight of possibilities that had materialized out of nowhere. The gas station's parking lot had become an unlikely sanctuary, a place where three lives had intersected in ways none of them could have predicted. Okay, David said finally, but if this goes sideways, if you change your mind or decide we're too much trouble, I won't, Marcus interrupted. I give you my word. Your word doesn't mean much to me yet, David said honestly. But Miguel's a good judge of character, and he seems to think you're all right. Marcus laughed, a sound rusty from disuse. I'll take that endorsement. The drive to Marcus's house in the West Hills took 20 minutes, but it felt like traveling to another planet. David sat in the passenger seat of the Bugatti, Miguel secured in a car seat that Marcus had insisted on buying at an all-night pharmacy along the way. The city lights blurred past the window, but David's attention was focused on his brother's reflection in the side mirror. Miguel was fascinated by the car's interior, his wide eyes taking in details David couldn't even identify. The leather seats probably cost more than David had ever seen in one place, and the dashboard looked like something from a spaceship. But what struck him most was how comfortable Marcus seemed in this environment, how natural it appeared for him to navigate through neighborhoods David had only seen in movies. Tell me about Miguel, Marcus said, as they wound through increasingly expensive residential streets. What's he like besides being happy all the time? David smiled, some of his tension easing as he focused on his favorite subject. He's smart, really smart. He figured out how to open cabinet doors when he was 10 months old, which was a problem when we were staying at that shelter downtown. He loves music, any kind of music. I used to work at this restaurant that had a radio in the kitchen, and whenever a song came on, he'd start bouncing and clapping his hands. Used to work? Yeah. The owner found out I was underage and couldn't legally hire me. Didn't matter that I was the best prep cook they had. David's voice carried the resignation of someone who'd learned that being good at something didn't always translate to being allowed to do it. Marcus made a mental note to call his lawyer in the morning. There had to be ways around the age restrictions, especially if David was supporting a dependent. The legal system was designed to protect minors, but sometimes those protections became barriers for kids who were already supporting themselves. What about school? Marcus asked. I was a senior at Jefferson High before everything fell apart. Had pretty good grades too, especially in math and science. But when Dad left and we got evicted from our apartment, keeping Miguel safe became more important than algebra homework. Marcus heard the weight of abandoned dreams in David's matter-of-fact recounting. How many teenagers had to choose between education and survival? How many potential futures were lost to circumstances beyond their control? They pulled through an electronic gate that opened automatically as they approached, revealing a driveway that curved through landscaped grounds toward a house that looked more like a museum than a home. David felt his stomach tighten with intimidation, but also with a fear he hadn't expected. What if Miguel broke something? What if they didn't belong in a place this pristine and perfect? "Don't worry," Marcus said, reading his expression. "It's just a house. A really big, really empty house that could use some life in it." The guest house, when they reached it, was larger than any apartment David had ever lived in. It had 2 bedrooms, a full kitchen, and a living room with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city. Miguel immediately began exploring, crawling across hardwood floors that gleamed under recessed lighting. "This is too much," David said, overwhelmed by the space and the implications of accepting such generosity. "It's not enough," Marcus replied. "But it's a start." That first night, David lay awake in a bed that felt too soft after months of sleeping on concrete and cardboard. Miguel was in a proper crib that Marcus had somehow procured, while David was taking his first hot shower in weeks. The silence was unsettling after so many nights of staying alert for danger, for police sirens, for the sounds that meant it was time to move again. But even more unsettling was the growing realization that Marcus Chen, billionaire tech mogul, seemed genuinely invested in their well-being for reasons that had nothing to do with tax breaks or publicity. During their late-night conversation over takeout Thai food, Marcus had listened to David's plans and dreams with the same attention he probably gave to merger proposals. "I want to finish high school," David had said, "and maybe go to college if I can figure out how to pay for it. I want to study engineering, design things that help people. But mostly, I want Miguel to have choices I never had. I want him to know he's loved and safe, and that he can become anything he wants to be." Marcus had nodded, as if these were perfectly reasonable goals instead of impossible dreams for a homeless teenager with no resources. "We can make that happen," he'd said, and somehow, David had believed him. Over the following weeks, Marcus kept his promises in ways both large and small. A private tutor was hired to help David catch up on the credits he'd missed, while Miguel attended a high-end daycare where he was doted on by staff who fell in love with his sunny disposition. Marcus visited regularly, sometimes for dinner, sometimes just to play with Miguel or help David with his physics homework. What surprised David most was how much Marcus seemed to need these visits. The successful businessman who commanded boardrooms and negotiated billion-dollar deals became a different person around Miguel, laughing at the baby's antics with a joy that seemed both rusty and genuine. And with David, Marcus showed a vulnerability that seemed at odds with his public persona. "I never learned how to be part of a family," Marcus admitted one evening as they watched Miguel attempt to stack blocks higher than his own head. "After my parents died, I convinced myself that independence was the same thing as strength. But watching you two together, I realize I might have confused being alone with being strong." David looked up from the college applications spread across the dining table. Marcus had insisted on hiring a college counselor, but David wanted to understand every part of the process himself. "You're not alone anymore," he said simply. "I mean, if you don't want to be." The transformation in both their lives happened gradually, then all at once. David passed his GED with scores high enough to earn him early admission to Portland State University, with a full scholarship that Marcus had quietly arranged through his foundation. Miguel celebrated his second birthday with a party that filled the main house with laughter for the first time in years. But it was the quiet moments that meant the most. Marcus teaching Miguel to take his first steps across the living room floor. David helping Marcus understand why his latest acquisition had failed to integrate successfully with his existing companies. The three of them falling asleep during movie nights, curled together on the oversized couch, like an unlikely family that had chosen each other against all odds. 6 months after that first night at the gas station, Marcus made a decision that surprised even him. Standing before the cameras at a press conference meant to announce his company's latest quarterly earnings, he found himself telling a different story entirely. "I want to talk to you about something more important than profit margins," he began, ignoring the surprised murmurs from the assembled reporters. "I want to talk about a night 6 months ago when I met two brothers at a gas station. I want to talk about how a 16-year-old Boy taught me more about leadership in one evening than I'd learned in 20 years of business school and boardroom experience." End quote. He told them about David's cardboard coat, about Miguel's innocent trust, about his own journey from homeless teenager to isolated billionaire and back to something resembling human connection. He announced the establishment of the Miguel David Foundation, dedicated to supporting older siblings caring for younger family members, with an initial endowment of $1 billion. But more than that, Marcus continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was about to reveal. "I want to announce that David Rodriguez, now 18 years old and a freshman at Portland State University, will be inheriting my companies upon my retirement. Not because of charity, not because of publicity, but because he's shown me what real leadership looks like. He's shown me that protecting the people you love, building something better with whatever materials you have, and never giving up on the possibility of tomorrow are the only qualifications that really matter." The press conference made international news, but back at the house, David and Miguel were oblivious to the media storm brewing around them. They were in the backyard, where David was teaching Miguel to kick a soccer ball while Marcus watched from the kitchen window, marveling at how completely his life had changed. That evening, as they sat together for dinner, Miguel clapping his hands and babbling in the high chair that had replaced his old cardboard throne, Marcus reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. He'd spent decades accumulating wealth and power, convinced that success was measured by what you could buy or control. But sitting here, watching David patiently clean mashed carrots off Miguel's face while explaining thermodynamics concepts he'd learned in his engineering classes, Marcus realized he'd finally found what he'd been searching for, without knowing it. "Thank you," he said suddenly, interrupting David's enthusiastic description of his latest project proposal. "For what?" David asked, looking genuinely puzzled. "For letting me be part of your family," Marcus replied. "For teaching me that cardboard can be a coat if you fold it with enough love. For showing me that the most important things in life aren't things at all." David smiled, the same radiant expression that had stopped Marcus in his tracks that first night at the gas station. "You don't have to thank me for that. Families don't keep score." Miguel chose that moment to throw his spoon directly at Marcus's head, giggling maniacally as mashed carrots splattered across his expensive shirt. Instead of being annoyed, Marcus laughed harder than he had in years, realizing that this sticky, chaotic, imperfect moment was exactly what he'd been missing his entire adult life. Later that night, after Miguel was asleep and David was absorbed in studying for his mechanical engineering midterms, Marcus sat in his office, staring at the wall of awards and recognition that had once defined his identity. Tomorrow, his lawyers would begin the complex process of transferring ownership of his companies to David, a transition that would take years to complete, but had already begun in the ways that mattered most. He thought about the cardboard coat, now preserved in a frame in his bedroom, not as a reminder of poverty overcome, but as a symbol of love made manifest. David had taken scraps that others would have, discarded and transformed them into protection for someone he cared about. Wasn't that what the best of human nature looked like? Taking whatever materials life provided and building something better, something that sheltered and protected and nurtured. Marcus had spent his career building an empire, but David had shown him how to build a family. The difference, he now understood, was that empires were built to last forever, while families were built to grow and change and become something new with each generation. His legacy wouldn't be measured in stock prices or market share, but in the young man who'd learned to turn cardboard into love, and the baby who'd grow up knowing that family wasn't about blood or money, but about choosing to show up for each other, day after day, no matter what. The wind outside rattled the windows, the same February wind that had brought them together at that gas station 6 months ago. But inside the house, warmth radiated from every room. Not from the expensive heating system, but from the laughter and conversation and sense of belonging that had taken root in spaces that had been empty for too long. In the guest house, David tucked Miguel into his crib and whispered the same Spanish lullaby he'd sung that first cold night. But now the words carried different meanings, promises, not just of survival, but of possibility, of futures that stretched ahead like open roads full of choices and opportunities. Miguel fell asleep with a smile on his face, surrounded by toys and books, and the security of knowing his big brother was always nearby. And in the main house, Marcus fell asleep planning scholarships and foundations and ways to help other families find their way from cardboard coats to something better. The cardboard coat still hung in its frame, a reminder of what was possible when love met determination. When someone with resources encountered someone with heart. When three lives intersected at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right way. It had been fragile and temporary, lasting only one cold night before being replaced by proper winter clothing. But the love that had constructed it, the family that had grown from it, and the foundation that had been built upon its example, those things were designed to last forever, growing stronger and more beautiful with each passing day, reaching toward a future none of them could have imagined, but all of them had helped to create. 3 years later, David stood at the podium of the Portland Kaya Convention Center, his graduation cap slightly askew as he addressed an audience of thousands. Miguel, now 5 years old and wearing a miniature suit that Marcus had insisted upon, sat in the front row swinging his legs and occasionally waving at his big brother with uninhibited enthusiasm. "When I was homeless," David began, his voice carrying clearly through the microphone system, "I thought survival was the only goal worth pursuing. I measured success by whether we found a safe place to sleep, whether Miguel had enough to eat, whether we could stay ahead of the systems that wanted to separate us." He paused, finding Marcus in the crowd, the man who had become more than a benefactor, more than a friend, something closer to the father neither of them had expected to find. "But today, as I graduate summa cum laude with degrees in both mechanical engineering and business administration, I understand that survival was never the end goal. It was preparation for something bigger, something that could help other families find their way from desperation to hope." The audience erupted in applause, but David's eyes remained fixed on Miguel, who had climbed onto Marcus's lap and was clapping with the concentrated effort that 5-year-olds brought to everything they deemed important. That image, Marcus realized, would join the framed cardboard coat as one of his most treasured memories. After the ceremony, they gathered at the house for a celebration that had grown far beyond their small family. David's college friends mingled with Marcus's business associates, while Miguel held court near the dessert table, regaling anyone who would listen with detailed explanations of how aunts could lift 50 times their own body weight. The little boy had inherited his brother's curiosity about how things worked, but where David approached problems with careful analysis, Miguel attacked them with fearless experimentation. "He's going to be trouble," laughed Dr. Sarah Chen, Marcus's cousin and Miguel's pediatrician, as they watched the boy attempt to demonstrate his aunt facts by lifting a chair that was clearly too heavy for him. "The best kind of trouble," David replied, swooping in to redirect Miguel's attention before he could hurt himself. "Hey buddy, want to show everyone your new robot?" Miguel's face lit up with the enthusiasm reserved for his latest obsession. He'd been building increasingly complex structures out of recycled materials, much to Marcus's delight and occasional concern for the safety of his furniture. Last week's creation had been a functioning pulley system made from old shoelaces and cardboard tubes that could lift Miguel's stuffed animals from his bedroom floor to his top bunk. "It walks and talks and can make sandwiches," Miguel announced proudly, though everyone present knew the sandwich-making claim was purely aspirational. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, the three of them found themselves alone in the living room, where they'd shared so many quiet moments over the past 3 years. Miguel had fallen asleep across both their laps, exhausted by the day's excitement and the attention from dozens of admiring adults. "I have something for you," Marcus said quietly, producing an envelope from his jacket pocket. "Consider it a graduation gift, though it's really something I should have given you a long time ago." David opened the envelope carefully, expecting perhaps a generous check or information about some new scholarship opportunity Marcus had discovered. Instead, he found legal documents that made his breath catch in his throat. "Adoption papers?" he whispered, afraid to believe what he was reading. "If you want them," Marcus said, suddenly uncertain. "I know you're both adults now, legally speaking, and you don't need a guardian or a parent or whatever I've been trying to be. But I thought, if you were willing, we could make it official." Make the family we've built together legally recognized. David's eyes filled with tears he hadn't expected, emotions that reached back to that scared 16-year-old who had wrapped his baby brother in cardboard and hoped for a miracle. You want to adopt us? Both of us? I want to be your father, Marcus said simply. Not because you need one, but because I need to be one. You've both taught me more about love and responsibility and what really matters than I ever learned in all my years of trying to build something permanent out of money and power. Miguel stirred in his sleep, unconsciously reaching for both of them with the instinctive trust that had characterized his entire relationship with the world. Even at 5, he seemed to understand that love was abundant rather than scarce, that there was always room for more people in the circle of care that had formed around him. Yes, David said, his voice thick with emotion. Yes, we'd like that very much. The paperwork was finalized on a Thursday morning in October, with Miguel serving as an enthusiastic witness who took his job very seriously despite having no legal standing in the proceedings. Judge Patricia Reyes, who had heard the story through the extensive media coverage, remarked that in 30 years of family court, she had never presided over an adoption that felt more like a celebration of what families could become, rather than a legal formality. It's not often we see families choose each other so completely, she said as they posed for pictures outside the courthouse. Usually there's some obligation, some biological connection, some external pressure that brings people together. But you three found each other and decided to build something new. That afternoon, they celebrated at Miguel's favorite restaurant, a family-owned Mexican place where the owner's grandmother always slipped Miguel extra churros, and where David had taken his first tentative steps back into the community he'd thought he'd lost forever. The walls were covered with family photos spanning generations, and Marcus found himself studying them with new understanding of what legacy really meant. It wasn't about buildings or bank accounts or board positions. It was about the stories that got passed down, the values that got transmitted from one generation to the next, the love that grew stronger rather than weaker as it was shared among more people. Dad, Miguel said suddenly, trying out the word as he had been doing all week. When I grow up, can I help kids like David used to be? Marcus felt his chest tighten with pride and purpose. What do you mean, buddy? Kids who don't have enough blankets or food or people to take care of them. David says there are lots of kids like that, and we should help them because we know how to make cardboard into coats. David and Marcus exchanged glances over Miguel's head, both recognizing the profound wisdom hidden in the 5-year-old's simple observation. They did know how to make cardboard into coats, metaphorically speaking. They knew how to take whatever materials were available and transform them into protection, comfort, hope. I think that's exactly what we should do, Marcus said seriously. In fact, I think it's what we're already doing. The Miguel David Foundation had grown beyond Marcus's original vision, providing not just financial support, but comprehensive services for families in crisis. They'd opened 3 residential facilities where older siblings caring for younger family members could live while finishing their education or job training. They'd partnered with local schools to provide tutoring and childcare services. They'd created a network of mentors, people who understood what it meant to carry responsibility too heavy for young shoulders. But more than the programs and services, they created something harder to quantify, a shift in how their community thought about family and responsibility and the obligation to care for each other. The story of the cardboard coat had become a touchstone, a reminder that love could transform the most unlikely materials into something precious. David's first job after graduation was as Director of Family Services for the Foundation, a position that allowed him to use both his engineering problem-solving skills and his intimate understanding of what families in crisis actually needed. His office was in the same building as Marcus's corporate headquarters, but the 2 spaces couldn't have been more different in atmosphere or purpose. Where Marcus's office was all clean lines and expensive materials, David's was warm and cluttered, filled with children's artwork and thank you letters from families they'd helped. There were prototypes of improved temporary shelters designed with input from people who had actually lived on the streets, and scale models of affordable housing projects that prioritized community space and child safety. Miguel spent his after-school hours in David's office, doing homework at a small desk they'd installed in the corner, and helping with projects that were deemed age-appropriate. His presence added an element of joy and unpredictability to the serious work of social services, and David often found that Miguel's questions led to insights that years of professional training hadn't provided. "Why do some kids not have moms and dads?" Miguel asked one afternoon, as he colored a picture of their family that included approximately 15 people and 2 dogs, despite their actual family containing only 3 people and no pets. "Sometimes moms and dads can't take care of kids the way they should," David explained carefully. "Sometimes they get sick, or they don't have enough money, or they make bad choices. But that doesn't mean the kids aren't important or loved. Like how our first dad couldn't take care of us, but then we found Marcus?" David paused in his review of funding applications, struck by how clearly Miguel understood the complexities that adults often struggled to navigate. "Exactly like that. Sometimes families aren't the ones you're born into. Sometimes they're the ones you choose. Are we going to choose more people for our family?" Miguel asked with the matter-of-fact tone he used for questions about whether they were having pizza for dinner or when they might get those dogs he kept including in his family portraits. David looked across the office to where Marcus was visible through the glass partition, engaged in what appeared to be an intense phone conversation with someone in Tokyo or Singapore or one of the other cities where his business interests stretched. Even 3 years into this relationship, David sometimes marveled at how naturally Marcus had transitioned from ruthless businessman to devoted father, how completely he'd embraced the chaos and unpredictability that came with loving a 5-year-old. "Maybe," David said thoughtfully. "Would you like that?" Miguel considered this with the seriousness he brought to all important decisions. "I think we have room for more love," he concluded. "Love gets bigger when you share it, right? Like how Marcus got happier when he started being our dad, and you got less scared when you didn't have to take care of everything by yourself." Out of the mouths of babes, David thought, amazed once again by his little brother's intuitive understanding of emotional mathematics. Love wasn't diminished by division. It was multiplied by addition. The more people who were included in their circle of care, the stronger and more resilient that circle became. That conversation planted a seed that grew into the Foundation's most ambitious project yet, the campus-style facility that could house multiple families in transition while providing comprehensive support services. They called it Cardboard Castle, both as a tribute to their origin story and as a reminder that temporary solutions could become the foundation for permanent change. The groundbreaking ceremony took place on a crisp spring morning, with Miguel serving as the honorary project manager and insisting that everyone wear hard hats, including the mayor and the local news crews who had come to cover the event. Marcus had invited several of the families they'd helped over the years, and the crowd included children of all ages, teenagers who had aged out of foster care, and older siblings who had found ways to keep their families together against impossible odds. "We're not just building apartments," David told the assembled crowd, holding Miguel's hand as they stood before the architectural renderings that showed a complex designed around community space and child safety. "We're building a place where families can heal and grow and discover what they're capable of when they have support and time and hope." Marcus watched from the side of the stage, remembering the scared teenager who had spoken to him in careful, guarded sentences that first night at the gas station. The man addressing the crowd today was confident and articulate, someone who commanded respect not because of inherited wealth or position, but because of what he'd overcome and what he'd built from the ruins of his childhood. "Every family deserves a chance to write their own story," David continued, his voice carrying across the construction site, where crews would soon begin turning blueprints into reality. "Every child deserves to know they're worth protecting, worth investing in, worth believing in, even when the circumstances of their birth suggest otherwise." The crowd erupted in applause, but Marcus found himself thinking about the cardboard coat hanging in his bedroom, about the night that had changed everything for all of them. David had been protecting Miguel even then, finding ways to make love visible and tangible, even when he had nothing but scraps to work with. Now they had resources and connections and the power to change systems rather than just survive them. But the impulse was the same, the fundamental human drive to create safety and comfort for the people you loved, using whatever materials were available and trusting that love could transform even the most unlikely foundations into something beautiful and lasting. After the ceremony, they went home to the house that had become the anchor point for their ever-expanding definition of family. Miguel immediately began construction of his own cardboard castle in the backyard, enlisting the help of several neighborhood children who had been drawn by the promise of engineering challenges and snack breaks. David and Marcus sat on the back porch, watching the controlled chaos of 5-year-old construction management and marveling at how completely their lives had been transformed by one moment of connection across grass. Seemingly impossible differences. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't stopped that night?" David asked, accepting the beer Marcus offered and settling into the comfortable silence they'd learned to share. "Every day," Marcus admitted. "But I think we would have found each other somehow. Some connections are too important to be left to chance." "You think it was destiny?" Marcus considered this, watching Miguel direct his construction crew with the authority of someone who had never doubted his right to be heard and taken seriously. "I think it was two people recognizing something they needed in each other. You needed resources and stability. I needed purpose and connection. Miguel needed a family that could see his potential instead of just his circumstances. And now? Now we need each other in different ways. You challenge me to be better than I thought I could be. Miguel reminds me that joy is a choice we make every day, and I get to be part of something that will outlast any business deal or stock price." As if summoned by their conversation, Miguel appeared at Marcus's elbow, covered in dirt and cardboard fragments, and wearing an expression of intense concentration. "Dad, we need more tape, and maybe some string, and definitely more boxes, because we're building a bridge to connect our castle to David's old office, and it has to be strong enough for all the kids who are going to live there when, quote, it's finished." Marcus looked at David, both of them recognizing the moment when a child's play revealed deeper truths about the world they were building together. Miguel's cardboard castle wasn't just a backyard project. It was a vision of connection and community, of spaces designed for children who needed to know they belonged somewhere safe and permanent. "I think we can find some string," Marcus said seriously, treating Miguel's architectural requirements with the same attention he'd once given to merger negotiations. "But we might need to consult with the chief engineer about load-bearing requirements." Miguel turned to David with expectant eyes, completely confident that his big brother could solve any problem that involved making things work better. And David, looking at the cardboard fortress taking shape in their backyard, saw echoes of that first night when he'd wrapped scraps around Miguel's tiny body and promised that somehow, some way, everything would be all right. "Let's go see what we can build," David said, standing and offering his hand to Miguel. "I think we're going to need a lot more cardboard." 5 years passed in a blur of groundbreaking ceremonies, ribbon cuttings, and quiet moments that mattered more than any public recognition. Miguel turned 10 with the kind of birthday party that spilled across 3 backyards and required a permit from the city for the bounce house that had somehow become essential to his celebration planning. David married Elena Vasquez, a social worker he'd met during a conference on innovative housing solutions, in a ceremony that Miguel insisted should include a cake shaped like their original cardboard castle. Marcus walked David down the aisle with the same nervous pride he'd once reserved for major acquisitions, but this transaction involved his heart rather than his portfolio. Elena had won over both father and son by treating Miguel like the brilliant, complex person he was, rather than a cute accessory to their relationship. And her own experience growing up in foster care gave her an understanding of their family dynamics that needed no explanation. The wedding reception was held at Cardboard Castle, which had evolved from ambitious blueprints into a thriving community that housed 47 families and maintained a waiting list that stretched for months. Children played in courtyards designed for safety and joy, while their parents attended job training programs or finished high school diplomas in classrooms that doubled as community meeting spaces after hours. "I can't believe this place exists," Elena said, as she and David swayed to music that drifted from speakers hidden among carefully planted trees. "When I was Miguel's age, bouncing between placements, I used to dream about somewhere like this, somewhere that felt permanent even when everything else was temporary." David spun her slowly, taking in the sight of Marcus teaching Miguel and several other children an elaborate dance he claimed to have learned in Beijing, though everyone suspected he was making up the steps as he went along. It almost didn't exist. There were so many moments when the funding fell through, when the city council balked at the zoning requirements, when I wondered if we were trying to build something too ambitious. But you didn't give up. Oh, Miguel wouldn't let me. Every time I got discouraged, he'd show me another drawing of his castle design, or he'd ask when the kids were going to move in. Or he'd remind me that some family somewhere was still sleeping in their car, waiting for us to finish building. Elena followed his gaze to where Miguel was now attempting to teach Marcus's dance to a group of teenagers, who were mostly laughing too hard to follow the steps correctly. He's going to change the world, isn't he? He already has, David replied. He changed ours. The following Monday, Miguel started 5th grade at a progressive private school that Marcus had carefully researched for its emphasis on project-based learning and social justice. Miguel's first assignment was to identify a problem in his community and propose a solution, which led to 3 weeks of intensive research on playground accessibility for children with mobility challenges. His presentation to the class included detailed drawings of adaptive swing sets, wheelchair-accessible climbing structures, and what he called quiet zones for kids who got overwhelmed by too much stimulation. But what impressed his teacher most was Miguel's insistence on interviewing actual children with disabilities rather than just researching online. I asked my friend Carmen what she wished playgrounds had. Miguel explained to his classmates with the confidence of someone who had never doubted that his ideas mattered. She uses a wheelchair, and she said most playgrounds make her feel left out because everything is too high or too narrow or too hard to reach. So I designed equipment that works for everyone, not just kids who can run and climb. David received a call from Miguel's teacher that afternoon, praising his presentation skills and requesting a meeting to discuss advanced academic opportunities. But when he shared the news with Miguel, the boy seemed more interested in discussing implementation than recognition. Can we build one? A playground like I designed? Miguel asked over dinner that night. Maybe a cardboard castle? The kids there don't have anywhere really good to play, and some of the moms have babies who need safe spaces too. Marcus set down his fork, studying Miguel's earnest expression with the same attention he'd once given to market analyses. How much do you think a project like that would cost? Miguel pulled out a notebook that had become his constant companion, filled with sketches and calculations that impressed adults who forgot he was still in elementary school. I researched prices online. The basic equipment would be maybe $50,000, but if we want the really good accessible stuff, it's more like $200,000, plus installation and safety inspections. And permits. That's a lot of money, David observed, though he was already mentally calculating foundation budgets and wondering which grants might fund playground construction. But think about how many kids would use it every day, Miguel countered. If we divide the cost by all the kids who will play there over the next 10 years, it's actually a really good investment. Plus, happy kids means less stressed parents, which means better family stability, which means fewer kids ending up in foster care. End quote. Elena nearly choked on her water. Did you just conduct a cost-benefit analysis for playground equipment? Miguel's been reading David's work reports, Marcus explained, pride evident to his voice. He's picked up some interesting perspectives on social policy. I like understanding how things work, Miguel said matter-of-factly. If you want to fix problems, you have to understand why they happen in the first place. That conversation sparked what became known as the Miguel Initiative, a comprehensive study of how physical environment affected child development and family stability. Miguel insisted on being listed as a research consultant, despite being only 10 years old, and his insights often surprised the PhD-level researchers who had initially planned to indulge him rather than actually listen to his ideas. Children know things adults forget. Dr. Rebecca Martinez, the study's lead researcher, explained to the local newspaper when asked about including a 5th grader on her research team. Miguel has lived experience that's just as valuable as our academic training. He understands what it feels like to be vulnerable and scared, but he also knows what safety and love can create. That perspective is IY. Invaluable. The playground opened 8 months later with a ceremony that drew visitors from across the state, including several families who had driven hours just to see equipment designed by a kid who understood what other kids actually needed. Miguel cut the ribbon with scissors almost as big as he was, then immediately ran to test every piece of equipment with the thoroughness of a professional safety inspector. But what moved the adults most was watching Carmen, his friend from school, navigate the playground in her wheelchair with the same ease and joy as the children who scrambled up climbing walls and swung from monkey bars. For the first time in her 9 years, she could participate in playground activities instead of just watching from the sidelines. "This is what inclusion actually looks like," Elena whispered to David as they watched Miguel and Carmen collaborate on building something elaborate in the sandbox that had been designed with multiple height levels to accommodate different abilities. He doesn't just want to help people, David realized. He wants to change the systems that make help necessary in the first place. That insight proved prophetic when Miguel started middle school and immediately began questioning why some of his classmates had access to tutoring and test prep, while others struggled with basic supplies. His solution was typically direct and systematic. He organized a peer tutoring network that paired students based on complementary strengths rather than just academic achievement levels. Within a semester, the program had improved test scores across all grade levels and created friendships that crossed the social boundaries that usually divided middle schoolers. Miguel's homeroom teacher nominated him for the state's Young Leadership Award, but he insisted the recognition should go to the entire tutoring network. "It wasn't my idea, really," he explained to the selection committee via video call, wearing the serious expression he adopted for important conversations. "I just noticed that some kids were good at math, but struggled with writing. And other kids were great readers, but needed help with science. It seemed obvious that they should work together instead of just the smart kids helping the kids who were behind." End quote. Marcus watched the interview from his office, marveling at how naturally Miguel had internalized lessons about collaborative leadership that took most executives decades to learn. The boy understood instinctively that sustainable solutions required everyone to contribute their strengths, rather than just some people sharing their advantages. The award ceremony was held at the state capitol, with Miguel delivering a brief acceptance speech that focused entirely on the other students in his program. But it was his impromptu conversation with the governor afterward that made headlines across the region. "Sir, can I ask you something?" Miguel had said as photographers captured what was supposed to be a standard meet-and-greet moment. "Why don't all schools have programs like ours? It doesn't cost extra money. It just requires organizing what's already there differently." Governor Patricia Adams, who had expected typical middle school nervousness or requests for selfies, found herself engaged in a 15-minute policy discussion with someone young enough to need a booster seat, but insightful enough to identify gaps in statewide education initiatives. "You know what, Miguel?" she said finally. "I think you should come visit us in Salem. We could use your perspective on some educational policy questions." That visit, which David and Marcus had expected to be a brief photo opportunity, turned into a 3-hour consultation session where Miguel presented a detailed analysis of peer tutoring implementation across different school districts. His recommendations were incorporated into a statewide pilot program that launched the following fall. "I think we might be raising the future governor of Oregon," Marcus joked as they drove home from Salem, but Miguel was already focused on his next project. "I want to understand why some kids age out of foster care without families," he announced from the back seat, where he was reviewing notes from their meeting with the Department of Human Services. "Elena says there are teenagers who never get adopted because people think they're too old or too damaged, but that doesn't make sense. Teenagers are awesome. Look at how awesome David was when you found us." David felt his throat tighten with emotion at the casual confidence in Miguel's voice, the assumption that of course David had been worth saving, worth loving, worth believing in. Sometimes he still marveled at how completely Miguel had internalized the security and love that surrounded him now. How naturally he extended that same assumption to other children who were struggling. "What do you want to know about foster care?" Elena asked, turning around to face Miguel with the serious attention she gave all his questions. "Everything. How kids get into the system, why some get adopted and others don't, what happens when they turn 18 and have to leave, I want to understand the whole process so we can figure out how to fix the parts that are hard-working. That summer, Miguel spent 2 weeks shadowing Elena at her job, observing family court proceedings, and sitting in on placement meetings with the solemnity of someone who understood he was witnessing life-altering decisions. His presence transformed routine bureaucratic processes into opportunities for everyone involved to remember they were dealing with children's futures rather than case files. He asks questions that make us think differently about everything we do, Elena's supervisor told David during one of Miguel's visits. Yesterday he wanted to know why we separate siblings during placement, when we know family connections are crucial for child development. Today he's wondering why we don't have programs to help biological parents address the problems that led to removal in the first place. These aren't new issues, but somehow hearing them from him makes the urgency more apparent. Miguel's summer research culminated in a presentation to the county's Child Welfare Board that was equal parts heartbreaking and inspiring. Using data he'd collected and stories he'd heard, he painted a picture of a system that meant well but often failed the children it was designed to protect. The problem isn't that people don't care, he concluded, standing before a room full of social workers, judges, and administrators who had devoted their careers to child welfare. The problem is that we've created a system that treats symptoms instead of causes. We take kids away from dangerous situations, but we don't always help them heal from what they experienced. We find them new families, but we don't teach them how to trust again. We age them out of care, but we don't give them the skills to build adult relationships. He paused, looking around the room with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his right to be heard. My brother and I were lucky. We found each other, and then we found Dad, and now we have Elena too. But that was luck, not a system. Other kids deserve better than luck. The room was silent for a long moment before erupting in applause that lasted several minutes. But Miguel seemed less interested in the recognition than in the commitments that followed, as board members pledged to implement several of his recommendations and invited him to serve as a youth advisor to their committee. That fall, at age 12, Miguel started high school through an accelerated program that allowed him to take advanced courses while continuing his advocacy work. His schedule included calculus, AP history, and what his teachers had started calling applied social justice, though Miguel insisted it was just problem-solving on a larger scale. His first high school project was typically ambitious. A comprehensive analysis of how early childhood trauma affected academic achievement, with specific recommendations for classroom interventions that teachers could implement without additional funding or training. The research required him to interview dozens of students, teachers, and counselors, synthesizing their experiences into actionable policy suggestions. Most people think kids who act out in school are just troublemakers, Miguel explained to a packed auditorium during his presentation to the school board. But trauma research shows that disruptive behavior is often a symptom of emotional dysregulation caused by adverse childhood experiences. Instead of punishing kids for having normal responses to abnormal situations, we should be teaching them coping strategies and creating classrooms that feel safe and predictable." End quote. His recommendations included simple changes like providing quiet spaces for overwhelmed students, training teachers to recognize trauma responses, and creating mentorship programs that connected struggling students with stable adults. The cost was minimal, but the potential impact was transformative. "This kid is going to revolutionize how we think about education," the superintendent whispered to Marcus during the presentation. "He's 12 years old, and he's identifying systemic problems that we've been struggling with for decades." But Miguel's most significant achievement that year wasn't academic or policy-related. It was personal, and it started with a conversation that took place on a random Tuesday evening as the family gathered for dinner. "I want to find our first dad," Miguel announced over Elena's homemade enchiladas, causing David to nearly choke on his water. "Why?" David asked carefully, his voice neutral despite the surge of complicated emotions Miguel's words had triggered. "Not because I want him to come back or anything," Miguel clarified quickly, reading his brother's expression with the intuitive understanding that had always existed between them. "I just want to understand what happened. Why he left, where he went, If he ever thinks about us. I know you're my real family, but I feel like there's this missing piece in our story. Marcus set down his fork, recognizing the weight of the moment. They'd talked about Miguel's biological father over the years, always honestly, but without actively seeking information about his whereabouts or circumstances. Now Miguel was old enough to want answers to questions that had been forming since he was old enough to understand that some families looked different from others. That's a big decision, Elena said gently. Are you sure you're ready for whatever we might find? Miguel nodded, with the same seriousness he brought to all his important choices. I've been thinking about it for a while. I know he might not want to see us, or he might be in jail, or he might have started a new family and doesn't want us to be part of it. But I also know that not knowing is harder than knowing, even if the truth isn't what I hope it is." End quote. David felt his chest tighten with protectiveness and pride in equal measure. The boy who had once been small enough to wrap in cardboard was now mature enough to seek difficult truths with his eyes wide open. "If this is what you want, we'll help you find him," he said finally. "But we do it together. All of us." The search took 3 months and revealed a story that was both heartbreaking and predictable. Roberto Rodriguez had indeed left Portland after abandoning his sons, but not to find work as he'd claimed. He'd struggled with addiction and mental illness, cycling through treatment programs and brief periods of stability before disappearing again into homelessness and despair. They found him at a transitional housing facility in Sacramento, thin and prematurely aged, but clean and sober for 8 months. The reunion was arranged through social workers who specialized in family reconciliation, with careful preparation and realistic expectations about what such meetings could and couldn't accomplish. Miguel approached the meeting with the same methodical preparation he brought to all his projects, researching addiction recovery and reading everything he could find about successful family reunification. But when he finally sat across from the man who had created him and abandoned him, his questions were simpler than anyone had expected. "Are you okay now?" Miguel asked, studying Roberto's face with clinical interest, rather than anger or longing. "I'm trying to be," Roberto replied, his voice hoarse with shame and regret. "I know I can't undo what I did to you boys. I know I don't deserve forgiveness or another chance. I hope you turned out okay, despite everything I put you through." "We turned out better than okay," Miguel said matter-of-factly. "David graduated from college and runs a foundation that helps families like we used to be. I'm in high school, even though I'm only 12. And I'm working on changing child welfare policy. Marcus adopted us and became the dad we needed, and Elena married David and became part of our family too." End quote. Roberto's eyes filled with tears as Miguel recounted their lives with the pride of someone who understood exactly how extraordinary their story was. "I'm glad," he whispered. "I'm so glad you found people who could love you the way you deserved." The meeting lasted 2 hours, long enough for Miguel to satisfy his curiosity about his origins, but short enough that it didn't overwhelm anyone involved. Roberto asked no favors, made no requests for ongoing contact, and expressed only gratitude that his sons had survived and thrived despite his failures. On the drive back to Portland, Miguel was unusually quiet, processing emotions and insights that would take time to fully understand. But as they crossed the bridge into the city that had become their home, he spoke with the clarity that always emerged when he'd worked through a complex problem. "I'm glad we did that," he said. "Not because I want him back in our lives, but because now I understand that his leaving wasn't about us not being worth staying for. It was about him not knowing how to be the person we needed him to be." David felt tears prick his eyes at the wisdom in his little brother's voice, the generous interpretation of abandonment that spoke to Miguel's fundamental optimism about human nature. "How do you feel about everything?" "Complete," Miguel said simply. "Like I finally understand the whole story instead of just the good parts. Roberto gave me and David life, but you and Marcus and Elena gave us everything else. That feels like enough." 2 years later, Miguel graduated high school at 14 with a full scholarship to Stanford University, where he planned to double major in public policy and developmental psychology. The graduation ceremony was held in the same auditorium where he'd first presented his trauma-informed education research. But now the audience included college recruiters, policymakers, and journalists who had been following his work since his middle school breakthrough. "I know people think I'm rushing into adulthood," Miguel said during his valedictorian speech, looking impossibly young in his cap and gown, but speaking with the authority of someone who had spent years studying systems that affected millions of children. "But I'd been an adult since I was 14 months old, and David wrapped me in cardboard to keep me warm. The only difference now is that society has finally caught up to what my family has always known. That age is just a number when it comes to caring about other people's welfare." David watched from the front row, remembering the baby who had smiled through hunger and cold, who had trusted completely in his big brother's ability to keep him safe. That same trust had evolved into confidence in his own ability to protect other vulnerable children, but the essential optimism had never wavered. Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his chest as Miguel continued his speech, outlining plans to establish a youth advocacy institute that would train teenagers from foster care backgrounds to become policy consultants. At 61, Marcus had begun transitioning his business responsibilities to David, but Miguel's graduation marked a different kind of transition. The recognition that their family's influence would extend far beyond what any of them had originally imagined. Elena squeezed David's hand as Miguel concluded with a challenge to the adults in the audience. "Stop waiting for us to grow up before you take our ideas seriously. Stop assuming that age equals wisdom or that experience always leads to insight. Some of the most innovative solutions to intractable problems come from people who are young enough to believe that change is possible and naive enough to think that existing systems aren't permanent." The standing ovation lasted 5 minutes, but Miguel seemed more interested in the conversations that followed. As educators and policymakers approached with specific questions about implementation strategies and research methodologies, he handled each interaction with the same patient attention he'd learned from Gray. David's example, never dismissing a question as too basic or a concern as unworthy of consideration. The celebration dinner was held at Cardboard Castle, where the original 47 families had grown into a waiting list that stretched for years and a reputation that attracted visitors from around the world. The playground Miguel had designed was now used as a model for inclusive recreation spaces, and his trauma-informed classroom protocols had been adopted by 3 school districts. But the changes that mattered most to their family were harder to quantify. David had been promoted to executive director of the foundation, while Elena had started a training program for foster parents that emphasized maintaining sibling connections. Marcus had stepped back from day-to-day business operations to focus on strategic philanthropy, though he insisted his most important job remained being Miguel's chauffeur to various speaking engagements. "Remember when our biggest worry was finding a safe place to sleep?" David mused as they watched Miguel organize an impromptu soccer game that included kids from ages 5 to 15, each playing at their own skill level but somehow contributing to a cohesive whole. "Now, our biggest worry is making sure he doesn't burn out before he turns 20, Marcus replied, though his tone carried pride rather than concern. "Sometimes, I wonder if we created a monster." "The good kind of monster," Elena laughed, "the kind that terrorizes injustice and makes bureaucrats uncomfortable." Miguel's first semester at Stanford was everything they'd expected and nothing they'd prepared for. Academically, he thrived in classes that challenged him to think more rigorously about problems he'd been tackling intuitively for years. Socially, however, he struggled to connect with classmates who were 4 years older and often seemed more interested in fraternity parties than policy reform. "It's not that they're bad people," Miguel explained during one of their weekly video calls, looking tired in a way that had nothing to do with academic workload. "They're just different. They care about things like grade curves and internship prestige, and whether they'll get invited to the right networking events. I care about whether the foster care kids in Santa Clara County have access to mental health services." "Maybe you need to find your tribe," David suggested. "There have to be other students there who care about social justice issues. I found some graduate students in the public policy program who take me seriously, and there's a professor in the psychology department who's doing research on institutional trauma that's actually useful. But most of the undergraduates think I'm either a curiosity or a threat to the curve." Marcus leaned into the camera frame, Want to come home? You could always defer and start again when you're older. No, Miguel said immediately. This is where I need to be right now. I'm learning things I couldn't learn anywhere else, and I'm making connections that will be important for the work I want to do. It's just lonelier than I expected. That loneliness began to ease during Miguel's second semester, when he joined a research project studying the long-term effects of childhood trauma on academic achievement. His role was supposed to be limited to data, entry, and literature review, but within weeks, he was co-authoring research proposals and designing interview protocols that impressed doctoral students who had been studying these issues for years. Miguel has an intuitive understanding of research methodology that usually takes years to develop. Dr. Sarah Kim, the project's principal investigator, told David during a parent conference that had been requested specifically to discuss Miguel's contributions to the research. But more than that, he brings a perspective that we desperately need. Too much academic research about vulnerable populations is conducted by people who have never experienced vulnerability themselves. The research culminated in a paper that Miguel co-authored with 3 graduate students, examining how early intervention programs affected long-term educational outcomes for children who had experienced homelessness. Their findings contradicted several widely accepted assumptions about PAMA, resilience, and recovery, leading to invitations to present at conferences across the country. We're challenging the narrative that children who experience trauma are permanently damaged. Miguel explained to an audience of educators and social workers in Chicago, his 15th birthday still 2 months away. Our data shows that with appropriate support systems, these children often develop exceptional problem-solving skills, emotional intelligence, and leadership capacity. The question isn't how to fix them, it's how to recognize and nurture the strengths they've already developed. David attended that presentation via live stream from his office in Portland, marveling at how confidently Miguel handled questions from audience members with decades more experience. But what struck him most was how naturally Miguel integrated personal experience with academic writing. Rigor, never using his own story as the primary evidence, but allowing it to inform his interpretation of broader data patterns. The research caught the attention of the MacArthur Foundation, which invited Miguel to apply for a fellowship that would fund his undergraduate education and provide resources for an independent research project. At 15, he would be the youngest recipient in the program's history of selected, a prospect that both thrilled and terrified his family. It's an incredible opportunity, Elena said, as they reviewed the application materials together. But it also means committing to a level of public scrutiny that most adults would find overwhelming. He's already dealing with that, Marcus pointed out. Every time he gives a presentation or publishes a paper, people focus as much on his age as his ideas. At least this way, he'd have institutional support and resources to do the work he wants to do. Miguel's application essay was characteristically direct and uncompromising. Instead of focusing on his personal journey from homelessness to academic success, he wrote about the systemic failures that made such journeys necessary in the first place. He outlined a research agenda that would examine how trauma-informed approaches could be scaled across multiple institutions, from schools to juvenile justice to foster care placement. "I'm not interested in being exceptional," he wrote in his closing paragraph. "I'm interested in making exception unnecessary. Every child who experiences trauma and adversity should have access to the support systems that helped me thrive. My goal is to identify what those systems look like and figure out how to make them available to everyone who needs them." The fellowship interview was conducted on Stanford's campus in front of a panel that included former cabinet secretaries, Nobel laureates, and social justice advocates whose work Miguel had been studying for years. Instead of being intimidated, he seemed energized by the opportunity to discuss his ideas with people who had the power to implement them on a national scale. "What do you see as the biggest obstacle to scaling trauma-informed interventions?" asked Dr. Patricia Williams, a psychologist whose research on childhood resilience had influenced Miguel's own work. "Honestly, adults who think they know what children need without actually asking children what they need," Miguel replied without hesitation. "Most intervention programs are designed by people who have never experienced the burr. problems they're trying to solve. They mean well, but they're often addressing symptoms rather than root causes because they don't understand how trauma actually affects daily decision-making. And your solution? Include people with lived experience in every stage of program development, from initial design to implementation to evaluation. Not as subjects to be studied, but as partners in creating solutions. And stop assuming that age or credentials are the best indicators of insight. Some of the most innovative approaches to complex problems come from people who are still young enough to think differently. The panel exchanged glances that Miguel couldn't interpret, but he pressed on with the confidence that had carried him through every important conversation of his life. I know I'm 15 years old. I know that makes some people uncomfortable. But I also know what it feels like to be responsible for another person's survival before you're old enough to tie your own shoes. I know what it's like to navigate systems that weren't designed for people like me. That experience is data too, and it's just as valid as anything you'll find in peer-reviewed journals. The fellowship announcement came 6 weeks later, along with a media attention that overwhelmed even Miguel's usual composure. Suddenly, he was fielding interview requests from national news programs and invitations to speak at conferences he'd only dreamed of attending. The attention was flattering, but also exhausting, particularly when reporters seemed more interested in his age than his research agenda. They keep calling me a child prodigy, Miguel complained during one of their family dinners, looking frustrated in a way that reminded David of his own teenage years, when well-meaning adults had focused on his circumstances rather than his capabilities. As if caring about other people's welfare is some kind of supernatural talent instead of basic human decency. Fame is weird, Marcus agreed, remembering his own complicated relationship with media attention during the early years of his business success. People want simple stories with clear heroes and villains. A teenager solving problems that adults have struggled with for decades makes good television, even if it oversimplifies what you're actually doing. The important thing is that you have resources now to do the work you want to do, David added. Try to see the media attention as a tool rather than a burden. If you can get people interested in your story, maybe they'll start paying attention to the issues you care about. Miguel considered this with the same analytical approach he brought to all strategic decisions. So I used the curiosity about my age to draw attention to systemic problems that affect millions of children who don't have access to microphones and fellowship funding. Exactly. You become the gateway drug to caring about child welfare policy. The strategy worked better than any of them had anticipated. Miguel's media appearances consistently redirected attention from his personal achievements to broader policy questions, and his social media presence became a platform for highlighting the work of other young advocates who were creating change in their own communities. But the real breakthrough came during his sophomore year, when Miguel's research on trauma-informed interventions was cited in a Supreme Court case involving juvenile justice reform. The brief he submitted, co-authored with his Stanford professors, argued that current sentencing practices for minors failed to account for the neurological and psychological effects of adverse childhood experiences. The question before this court isn't whether children who commit crimes should be held accountable. Miguel wrote in the section of the brief that legal scholars later called a masterpiece of accessible constitutional bomb argument. The question is whether our justice system should reflect what we know about child development and trauma recovery, or whether we should continue operating under outdated assumptions about moral culpability and rehabilitation potential. The court's decision, which established new guidelines for juvenile sentencing that emphasized treatment over punishment, referenced Miguel's research extensively. Overnight, he became the youngest person ever cited in a Supreme Court opinion, a distinction that brought both pride and pressure. I keep thinking about all the kids who are going to have different outcomes because of this decision, Miguel told the family during a celebration dinner that Elena had insisted on despite Miguel's preference for low-key recognition. Kids who will get therapy instead of prison sentences, who will have chances to turn their lives around instead of being written off as lost causes. You did that, David said simply. Your research, your testimony, your refusal to let people dismiss your ideas because of your age. You changed how the highest court in the country thinks about children and justice. Miguel shook his head with the humility that had somehow survived years of public recognition and academic achievement. We did that. This family, this foundation, all the people who shared their stories and trusted me to represent their experiences accurately. I was just the person with access to the microphone. But as Miguel entered his junior year at 16, the weight of constant public attention and adult responsibilities began to show in ways that worried his family. He was sleeping less, taking on more projects than any reasonable person could handle, and showing signs of the burnout that Marcus had warned about years earlier. "I'm fine," Miguel insisted when David raised concerns about his schedule, but the dark circles under his eyes and the tension in his shoulders suggested otherwise. "There's just so much work that needs to be done, and I finally have the platform to do it. I can't waste this opportunity." "You're not wasting anything by taking care of yourself," Elena said gently. "But you are risking your ability to do this work long-term if you don't learn to pace yourself." The conversation that finally got through to Miguel came from an unexpected source. Carmen, his friend from elementary school who had inspired his accessible playground design, was now in high school herself and had become an advocate for disability rights. She visited Stanford during one of Miguel's particularly overwhelming weeks, taking one look at his exhaustion and delivering a reality check that only childhood friends could provide. "You look terrible," she said bluntly as they sat in his dorm room surrounded by research papers and half-empty coffee cups. "When's the last time you did something just because it was fun?" "I don't have time for fun right now." Miguel replied, not looking up from the grant proposal he was reviewing. "There are 3 different research deadlines this month, plus the congressional testimony next week, plus the book manuscript that's due to Maia. Editor." "Miguel." Carmen's voice carried the authority of someone who had known him since they were children building cardboard castles together. "Look at me." When he finally raised his eyes, she continued with the directness that had always characterized their friendship. "Remember when we were kids, and you told me that happy kids meant better family stability? Well, you're not happy right now. You're stressed and overwhelmed and pushing yourself toward a breakdown. How does that help anybody?" The simple question hit Miguel like a physical blow, forcing him to confront the contradiction between his advocacy for children's well-being and his own self-destructive work habits. He stared at Carmen for a long moment, then burst into tears that seemed to come from months of accumulated stress and pressure. "I don't know how to slow down," he admitted between sobs. "Every time I say no to something, I think about all the kids who might be helped by that research or that policy change or that speaking engagement. How do I balance taking care of myself with feeling responsible for taking care of everyone else?" End quote. Carmen wheeled her chair closer and took his hands with the same gentle authority she'd inherited from years of navigating systems that weren't designed for her needs. "You take care of yourself so you can take care of everyone else for the next 60 years instead of burning out before you turn 20. You pace yourself so you can be in this fight for the long haul instead of flaming out spectacularly and leaving the work unfinished." That conversation marked a turning point that required input from the entire family and several of Miguel's professors. Together, they developed what Marcus called sustainable advocacy protocols, limits on speaking engagements and media appearances that would allow Miguel to focus on his research without sacrificing his academic progress or mental health. The changes weren't easy for someone who had spent years saying yes to every opportunity to help vulnerable children, but they proved essential for his long-term effectiveness. Miguel learned to delegate responsibilities to the growing network of young advocates he had inspired, and he began scheduling regular downtime with the same precision he brought to research deadlines. By the time he turned 17, Miguel had found a balance that allowed him to continue his policy work while actually enjoying his college experience. He joined the campus Ultimate Frisbee team, developed a passion for cooking that surprised everyone who knew his previous diet of research papers and energy bars, and even started dating a sophomore in the environmental science program who shared his commitment to systemic change but also insisted on regular hiking trips that had nothing to do with career advancement. "You seem happy," David observed during one of their video calls, noting the relaxed expression that had replaced Miguel's previous intensity. "Really happy, not just accomplished happy." "I am happy," Miguel replied, grinning at the camera with the same infectious joy he'd shown as a baby reaching for his brother's face. Turns out, you can care about changing the world, and still have time to enjoy the world you're trying to change. Who knew? Marcus leaned into the frame, looking older, but more content than he had in years. Wisdom is knowing that the work will always be there, but life happens in the moments between the work. Spoken like someone who finally learned that lesson himself, Miguel teased, referring to Marcus's own evolution from workaholic businessman to engaged father and grandfather figure. We're all still learning, Elena added from off-camera, where she was apparently cooking something that smelled amazing based on Miguel's repeated glances toward the kitchen. That's what families do. We figure it out together. As Miguel prepared to enter his senior year at Stanford, the trajectory of his life seemed both inevitable and miraculous. The boy who had been wrapped in cardboard to survive a February night was now positioned to influence policy affecting millions of children. But more than that, he had learned to balance his drive to help others with his own need for joy, connection, and the simple pleasures that made life worth living. The cardboard coat still hung in Marcus's bedroom, now accompanied by photos chronicling their journey from that first gas station encounter to Miguel's latest research presentation. But the real legacy wasn't captured in any frame or artifact. It lived in the thousands of children who had been helped by programs Miguel had designed, the policies that had been changed by his research, and the growing movement of young advocates who had been inspired by his example to believe that age was no barrier to creating change. And in a dorm room at Stanford University, a 17-year-old who had learned to transform scraps into love was now teaching others that the most important material for building a better world wasn't cardboard bourgeois, or money, or power, but the willingness to see everyone as worthy of protection, care, and the chance to become who they were meant to be.